Welcome to this explainer on Reconstruction and the states. Today, we're diving straight into the specific transitions the states went through following the Civil War. We're going to explore exactly how the fundamental structure of American governance shifted during this absolutely pivotal era, based entirely on our source documents. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering post-war conditions, Reconstruction governments, changes affecting the states, administrative restructuring, the long-term effects, and we'll wrap it all up with a summary. All right, Part 1, Post-War Conditions, focusing on the status of the states. To really grasp the post-war shifts, we first need to set our baseline. Coming out of the Revolutionary War, as highlighted in the 1793 Supreme Court case Chisholm versus Georgia, sovereignty actually devolved directly to the people. The source texts show that the people truly became free, subject only to the common law. Think of it this way. The state itself is only sovereign because the people making up that state are sovereign. But as time went on, a really stark contrast developed. The original system relied heavily on retained state sovereignty under the common law. However, dire economic straits and massive war debt catalyzed a huge change, according to the documents. This intense financial pressure ultimately led to the Civil War, which effectively turned the original constitutional framework into a corporate federal headquarters. Moving right along to Part 2, Reconstruction governments, and specifically restructuring by force. Take a look at this specific sequence of events outlined in the text. In late 1866, states like Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, which, mind you, had valid existing constitutions, rejected the proposed constitutional amendments. Well, in response, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts in 1867 and 1868. As a result, those original state governments were swept aside, and entirely new governments were erected in their place. Now, the sources make it clear this wasn't your standard political transition. The original state constitutions were completely nullified, and new governments were stood up by arbitrary congressional dictation. And get this, these changes were enforced under the restraint of military force, utilizing the Lieber Code. That's the martial law of the Civil War era, which the texts note was never properly lifted. Let's jump into Part 3, Changes Affecting the States. We're looking at shifts in citizenship and standing. That military restructuring of the state governments had some really profound implications for political status. The sources describe a strict legal delineation being made between a non-citizen, man or woman, one of the people, and a U.S. citizen. This newly defined federal citizenship actually categorized individuals as indentured servants, paid bureaucrats, or even corporate franchises. So what did this do? It resulted in the conversion of sovereign state citizens into federal citizens. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment created this new class of federal citizenship, which legally rendered individuals as wards under a federal guardianship. And because they were now classified as dependent wards, they became subject to administrative regulation rather than the original common law framework. This brings us to Part 4, Administrative Restructuring, focusing on the fiduciary model. This new guardian-ward relationship we just talked about, it required a massive administrative restructuring. Based on the texts, administrative agencies like the EPA, the IRS, and the DMV are defined as entities created by proxy settlers. Essentially, Congress and the president acted jointly as these proxy settlers for the sovereign people. They endowed these agencies with the authority to set and enforce regulatory policies over their dependents, things like building codes, motor vehicle codes, and zoning laws. The documents actually trace a direct four-step path right to this modern administrative framework. Step 1 was the Freedmen's Bureau, which was originally meant to organize dependent populations during the war. Step 2 was the 14th Amendment, which laid down a much broader federal guardianship. Step 3 involved creating public trusts by mortgaging individuals' right to property. And finally, Step 4, the formation of modern administrative agencies to operate this entire fiduciary model. According to the source material, this vast restructuring resulted in 3 distinct subcontractors managing affairs. You have the Confederation of States operating under general jurisdiction, the Territorial United States operating under international sea jurisdiction, and the Municipal United States operating under global air jurisdiction. It's crucial to note that the texts state these entities operate entirely distinct from the unincorporated republic. Let's look at Part 5, Long-Term Effects, specifically the legacy of Reconstruction. The texts argue that the lasting legacy of Reconstruction is the complete dominance of the administrative state. By adopting the Administrative Procedures Act, states silently supplanted their original de jure governments with quasi-corporate agencies. It gets to the point where executive offices and judicial branches are literally no longer public bodies, but private corporate entities. This is even how, according to the documents, the Buck Act allowed states to implement income taxes on a newly federalized population. So what we see depicted here is the historical claim that a territorial subcontractor essentially stepped in to usurp the powers originally meant for the federal republic. This system uses federal code and statutory law via admiralty and equity, rather than the original common law. Functionally, it's operating by pretending to be the original de jure government. Because the traditional branches of government have been superseded, we get this stark conclusion from the text. All these administrative agencies within the states are actually governing the government. Why? Because you're considered part of the United States corporation. They manage the population through a pervasive, unavoidable corporate framework. And finally, Part 6, Summary. Let's wrap up Reconstruction and the states. Let's distill the core takeaways from the documents we've just unpacked. We've seen a very linear historical shift here. It started with common law states' sovereignty, where the people were supreme. Then, massive Civil War debt catalyzed a shift to a corporate federal structure. The Reconstruction Acts utilized military force to unseat legitimate state governments and replace them with a 14th Amendment framework of federal guardianship. Ultimately, this allowed modern administrative agencies to completely replace traditional state governance. So, drawing strictly from the historical texts we've reviewed today, we have to ask ourselves, how does understanding this chronological shift from state sovereignty to corporate administrative governance change our view of the modern relationship between the states and the federal government? Understanding this timeline of jurisdiction, guardianship, and corporate structuring really forces us to re-examine our everyday interactions with the agencies that govern us. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.